have an operational background, worked in different countries, humanitarian crises around the globe, but soon questioned myself about the role of data protection and digital rights for people. When I wrote the study on digital accountability, we mainly looked at, the potential of digital tools for increasing, strengthening participation of affected people, but at the same time, acknowledging the risks and challenges and harms which can be exposed by digital technologies at the same time. So I'm nowadays mainly working on different aspects around digital technologies in the humanitarian sector from various angles. For the Center for Humanitarian Action, we mainly focus on data protection, digital participation, accountability from a social angle.
Thank you to kind of set the context, what the paper is about. So just to kind of say the long title, it's the untapped potential of participation when using digital technology in humanitarian action. And so this is something that we've read at TSF. A few members kind of discussed this paper, and something that kind of caught our eye is that you emphasize the importance of data literacy, digital literacy, when making informed decisions. And so that echoed our work in Ukraine. So in Ukraine and in Poland, where we share connectivity and information to affected populations. And we were curious, can you explain how the current crisis in Ukraine can illustrate your point?
I think the crisis in Ukraine is particularly interesting because, it's in comparison to most of the humanitarian crisis or context, they have a digital ecosystem. People are well aware of digital tools. They use digital communication for their own purposes. There's an e-governance system. So the context is well advanced in comparison to many other contexts. So people, on the one hand, know how to navigate these tools and then can take decisions about the type of tools to be used and how they want to use it. And at the same time, they also know their rights. So it's on the one hand, the kind of hard skills, knowing how to navigate specific tools, while at the same time you have the soft skills, understanding that you do have a right to understand what's happening with your data. People or colleagues keep on raising the fact that Ukraine really challenged them in the sense that even though Ukraine is not part of the EU and not abiding by GDPR, people know about GDPR and the general data protection rules of the European Union. So they know about their rights. And what GDPR is very strong about is the data subject rights, which most of the organizations are grappling with. So organizations suddenly ended up being asked what's happening to people's data without having answers because they don't have had the systems in place, or they don't have had the transparent type of governance. Deleting the data or erasing the data, in theory, it wouldn't have been possible because the data flows were not as accurate as to manage really to delete the data people had potentially requested for. So the more you know, the more you question. And I think that's the main aspect about informed decisions. People who might have never had a phone might not even understand the language on the phone. And I'm not talking about English, French, German, or whatever type of language, but more the icon communication type of language and the logic which is being used by an ordinary phone or a smartphone. So you have to start from scratch depending on the people you're working with. And in order to allow them to have take an informed decision, you have to build the basis for them to actually start understanding what is the real situation and what they can take decisions on. If that makes sense. But that's what we found out while working on the paper, and why the Ukraine context is particularly interesting to learn from, because people know about it and they can actually challenge the organizations to improve their structures and their systems in place.
And so related to this importance of information to make decisions and to kind of know your rights. TSF, like I told you about, currently distributes reliable information, so in Poland and across Latin America, through so there are remotely connected screens across different centers, different integration centers. And so this is why we're interested in something that you also mentioned in the study, which is communication channels and how to involve people who use these channels as much as possible. So my question, I guess, is what do you recommend to strengthen participation of affected populations with digital technologies?
Two main aspects is understand the context and diversify your channels as best as possible. So understanding the context would include understanding the type of communication tools which are already being used, which people are familiar with and which people do prefer because they trust them, even though, and that was actually interesting, which came out through the interviews I was conducting for the paper, is that most of the organization at that time were hardly using the known instant messaging tools and social media platforms for data protection reasons. They were not abiding with in-house regulations and they were not allowed to use them. So most of the organization put potential harms and risks over the actual benefits. Yeah, understand which different population segments and groups are using which type of tools. They might differ, and that's why I'm alluding to my second point, diversify. An old woman might not be using social media, Facebook, Meta, X, or whatsoever. They might be using their ordinary phone to get information, or they might be talking to their neighbor. So they might be offline and online tools, while a young person would rather prefer receiving the information through a screen, Facebook, and so on and so forth, and work with this kind of situation. Then you have different representatives or peers who are trusted within the community, and they can then spread the information to those who might not go and look at the screen, who might not be able to read the screen or whatsoever. So understanding the context and the needs and requirements as per the different population segments, and then diversify accordingly.
How can we ensure data protection, or at least try to ensure data protection when we integrate digital technologies in humanitarian contexts?
One of the main challenges is actually the operationalization. So it's not about being legally compliant with data protection. I guess most of the European-based organizations are on paper compliant with data protection, but then when you trickle it down and question how it actually is, how it's being implemented in country, it's a totally different story. If you really want to apply data subject rights, it would influence the way you collect your legal basis, meaning, do you collect consent? Is it vital interest? Is it public interest? And so on and so forth. So if you have collected consent, people should, in theory, and in practice ideally as well, take an informed decision to really consent to them providing the information and their data. The other question is, still linked to data subject rights, how do you manage your data? You look at the data life cycle. So you collect the data, then you manage it, you try to update it and keep it as accurate as possible. You erase it, you give people a chance of withdrawing it or rectifying it. Do you really have systems in place which would remind you that after 5 years I have to delete the data? And for that, of course, you need to have management decision makers behind you to invest in the resources, to invest in putting up the models, and to invest in people, in the frontline stuff, in your own stuff, and the data owners, the data subjects, meaning the people on the ground, the affected people. So protection people still have a challenge of thinking, doing no harm approaches from a digital perspective. It's a different type of analysis, but it's the same kind of approach when you do risk assessments or when you do context analysis. So I think my plaidoyer here is mainly demystify data protection. It is a legal concept. but it has to be implemented by everyone. We have to figure out how to implement it, either through data security, of having IT people making your system more secure through trainings and awareness raising for your own staff, for the people, the data you collect from, or by prioritizing, I don't know, data subject rights for people to know how to actually update and rectify the data. The middle management is actually key to take the decisions. But interesting enough, middle management lacks most of the information and knowledge for taking digitally related strategic decisions. So for an organization to invest in digital literacy amongst their staff, middle management seems to be key in order to be, well, it makes sense. They take budget decisions, team decisions, recruitment decisions, program decisions. So it's for me, it's a question about priorities and risk mitigation measures to understand what is the risk for your organization and what is the harm which you want to protect people from when you deploy a certain kind of technologies. I wouldn't say, and I think it's not feasible and realistic, that every organization can operationalize all aspects and issues of data protection with the resources available. Even the big ones are not able to do so. How do you expect small organizations to do so? So it's a question of strategic focus and prioritization. That's what I would say. And being transparent and acknowledge what you can do and what you cannot do.
So being transparent and acknowledge what we can and cannot do. So that's accountability.
Exactly. Yeah.
And my kind of final question would be related to that. So it's very simple. Can you give us an example of a successful implementation of digital accountability?
That was actually the toughest one, I have to admit, when I looked at the question.
So yes, it's simple, but it's like for me to say.
No, but I do have a favorite organization I usually like to quote, but maybe before talking about them, the different angles of looking at accountability from a legal, social, and technical perspective, again, you can ask yourself, how do I want to interpret digital accountability? Technically, of course, you can use all the different technical standards which are already existing. The one which I usually quote is IRC. They don't put the cart before the horse. I mean, the way they apply accountability is from a strategic point of view. They say, okay, we ask the people what they want, we discuss with them what is possible and feasible, and then we decide what we are taking on. Meaning, for them, digital is an option. It's not a means to an end, and it's not the only solution. So I think before you start talking about digital accountability, and you go a step back, start with the connectivity bit first, and then ask the question from a digital accountability perspective. Connectivity, as I said, why, for whom, by whom, and for what. And it's not just for humanitarian organizations to be operational, but for people to also have a chance of being connected to their loved ones. And then you can talk about participation, communication, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of the foundation or the basics for it all.
Well, thank you for taking the time to speak to me today, and let's speak soon again.
Happy to be in touch, yes.